So Nietzsche comes down from the mountain and says, God is dead, we have killed him. And my interpretation of that is not, as a kid growing up, his father was a Lutheran pastor, had a great impact on him. Remember, he originally went to seminary and so on. But then, being a bright student, came to conclude that his earlier beliefs were totally wrong. Didn't really come around to any other interpretation of that. But he ended up concluding that God doesn't exist. So when he's saying that God is dead, we have killed him, what he's talking about is the narrative, the traditional meta-narratives, the stories that God exists. So he's not saying that God ever existed. He's just saying that we have institutionalized stories that say that God exists.
Can we turn the music down a little bit?
Yeah, we can turn it off entirely. I put it on just to irritate folks. Things. So, yeah, that was Hildegard bumping some of her music. She was a great recording artist, even though it was 1100 AD. So it's the stories that he's talking about, the belief systems. God is dead. We no longer need the concept of God. Instead, basically, each individual is their own God. It's kind of another example of how the Kantian focus on the self, being the perceiver, can also be interpreted religiously, that I'm my own God. Incredible egoistic interpretation of all of that. But we no longer believe it. It's just the way that these authorities and these institutions manipulate all the people. But they don't even believe it. They just make the laity believe it. Right? What do you think of that? Does that strike a bell for any of you? Do you feel like that's true? I didn't give anybody an opportunity, I don't think, to argue with Nietzsche. Feel free.
I think it's a pretty bleak perspective. I think that whereas most, even in the religious community, would probably agree that the stories are just that, stories with intended, messages behind them, that they're not factual, but that the idea and that the concept is at least
Santa Claus.
Yeah,
Parents don't argue that Santa Claus really exists.
Yeah. But the intent is there.
Even the kids, like Roger Scruton points out, the kids fake it. They don't really believe in Santa Claus, but we fake it so that we don't disappoint our parents who want us to believe in it, right? So the parents are faking it, kids are faking it, everybody's faking it. But it's a nice story. Great explanation for why we could go commercial at the end of the year. Of course, there's historical, it's really the sun is coming back. Everybody, can you imagine, everybody was scared to death. The sun seems to be going away. Oh, it's coming back, yes.
Yeah, there's more light.
Hey. And Easter, oh, it's dead. The sun is dead. It's going away. You think, these are attached to physical phenomena in some way. Stories, that explain a lot of, why the stars are there, where they're going. But does it feel like Nietzsche is terribly hostile to something absolutely intrinsic to your belief system, your culture?
Yeah, I think that's probably a little bit there. It kind of doesn't even give the option of discussion in it, which if you have any two people, both are going to be wrong about most things. Fair fact. So saying that you are inherently right and there's no, saying a statement and then not really having a discussion on either side of it it's kind of a little bit more hostile than if it was a open-ended, this is why I've been led to believe because of this and this and this.
The absolutism of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're right. He doesn't really argue it. He assumes that if you're reading the same cultural conversation that he's been privy to in his university experience, then you understand where he's coming from. And remember, he also is reading Schopenhauer, who already, in a sense, argues for that. So if you want to really argue the point, I suppose, he says, well, Schopenhauer did it. You read Schopenhauer, and you're all set. And remember, Nietzsche is absolutely horrified by all of this, too, because he's like, what's going to give us a sense of moral stability? God is the only, the anchor for moral stability in the European system. Kant, remember, he puts God outside of phenomena, but argues that God must be there, otherwise there's no grounds for saying that this is morally right. I might have an intuition that this is the right thing to do. Yay, Saudi Arabia finally is allowing women to drive. Well, coming out of the Middle Ages, are we? Progress. And of course, a lot. That's a whole other thing. But what gives us the sense that there is that moral right? Well, so we need to talk about the definition of God, and that brings us back to Anselm, the article that starts off our readings for today. And Anselm is most famous for his particular version of the ontological argument. We could say that Augustine has a version of it. I would say that Aristotle has a version of it. You can't have now unless you had the beginning. Because if there is no beginning, then basically time is going in both directions at once, which means we can't have a now. It's a conceptually interesting puzzle. So there must be a beginning. And for Aristotle, there must be a first mover, because there's a chain of actions, and that chain can't go all the way back to infinity, because then there wouldn't be a now again, right? So conceptually, our Greek ancestors, Aristotle, tells us there has to be a beginning. We can't conceive of everything just being eternal all the time. Because there has to be a start point, and there has to be a starter. And for Aristotle, it's just the first mover, the prime mover. Theoretically, he even ties that into like the outer wheel or circle of the universe, so that all the circles inside are like moving because the outer wheel is moving them, and that's moving that, and then eventually we have the moon moving around the earth, and that moves the atmosphere, which creates the winds, which then he thinks creates all the action theoretically on the earth. That is absolutely bonkers stuff, actually. But for him, the prime mover is that very first circle that's moving all of the subsequent circles. So if you look at it that way, prime mover has to be there. But we could also interpret that as God. And in the Middle Ages, in the scholastic period, Aquinas will certainly feel that way and give us arguments for the existence of God, which are cosmological. Cosmos meaning, of course, the universe. So if we look at the universe and we see the things that are going on here, there must be a God, because God is that starting point. But Anselm gives us an interesting argument that's based on the actual definition of God. What is God? And in the text we see that the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And I wonder who is that fool. I personally like to think that it's Anselm himself, having reached a stage in his educational development, comes to conclude or begins to doubt. And so he, as he says, he's faith-seeking understanding. And so he puzzles it over, and he gives a definition which is essentially still current. So if you're a theologian, this is the definition of God used, no matter whether you're Islamic, you're Jewish. I think it's all the monotheistic religions basically end up using this definition, but at least we can trace it to Anselm in your text, and it's God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And it sounds maybe confuzzling because it's not, it's a via negativa. It's not the via affirmativa. So it's coming from kind of the negative approach, because you're not saying what God is, right? What you're saying is God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So that's not saying God is the greatest thing, which is, I think, where we normally like to head with that. But that's not actually what he says, because the trouble, of course, was saying God is that. Is that, well, wait a minute, I can think of something better than that. Or I can say, and it died. The sun, boom, it blew up. So crap, that couldn't have been God. Whatever, right? Big naked guy sitting on a throne, the Spartan throws a spear, hits him on the cheek. Wow, he wounded God. Well, he can't be God then. Right? So any attempt to actually define God in specific characteristics fails, has traditionally always failed. So what Anselm does that's interestingly different is uses a negative approach. He says, well, whatever is great isn't as great as God. Because God, by definition, is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So that's pretty cool, actually. Very puzzling. I think I have. So it's in here somewhere. But so if you think about it, how does this work? And does it work? So what my favorite comparison is pizza. Does pizza exist? Yes. Everybody agree pizza exists? And you could actually go out and find one. So it's really there, right? But let me ask this. Is there a largest pizza in Eagle River at this moment?
Yes.
A largest pizza in Eagle River.
As long as there's a pizza,
If pizza exists in Eagle River, there has to be a largest one.
there's also the smallest.
You see that leap that you just took? We don't even know where that largest pizza is. Plus, it might be being eaten as we speak, in which case it's no longer the largest one by a slice. But some other pizza automatically took its place. Because if there is a pizza, even if there's only one, well, by definition, that one's the largest and the smallest. No real contradiction there, right? It's the only pizza.
That's assuming there's
Right?
pizza there.
You
What if
go
there's-
home to your dog, you only have one, and you hug the dog and say, oh, you're my favorite dog, you're the best dog in the house. The dog doesn't know that, well, but it's the only dog in the house.
My dog ate a roll of toilet paper this morning, so it's not. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, toilet paper is delicious. Have you ever tried it? Especially with, like, tomato sauce. You're starving. I've seen people on TV eating mud. Put butter, mix it in with the sand, people will eat that. It's not very good. Sorry. Yeah, so pizza exists, and there has to be in Eagle River a largest pizza. In fact, let me just go, you can just go up, say, America, largest pizza, has to be. In the world, has to be, in the universe, has to be the largest pizza. What are we doing? Is that a good argument to say that yes, there has to be a largest pizza somewhere in the universe? It might be here in Eagle River. That's probably not. Probably somebody somewhere is famous, like in New York, for having the largest pizza on the block or something. They make like something huge that only good for parties or something.
It's making an exponential leap.
It tells you something about our language, right? That X is that in which nothing blank can be thought. So we could put in greatest, largest, greenest, ugliest, wettest,
Take an adjective.
obscene, greatest bunny. No, let's leave bunnies out of that. The great bunny. What would you call Hugh Hefner? He's dead. He died. Great American philosopher. That's what John Havelock said last night. But so you could put all sorts of things here, and that's why I left that as X, because it seems to imply, our language implies existence. If there is something, heavy tome, has to be a heaviest book somewhere, most boring book, most interesting book, most screwed up book, a book that has more misspellings than any of I've ever read.
But that's also subjective per
Yeah,
person.
That's subjective, of course, because I don't know which book that is.
And if you and somebody else argued, he would say, oh no, it's this one. He would say, oh no, it's this one.
And that's precisely what happens in arguments over God. When you're saying God is such and such, well, my God is much bigger than that. My God is stronger than your God. My God can, kill the Egyptians. Your gods are weak. And that's been done. So yeah, that's subjective. On the other hand, if there is such a thing as a book, even though we might intersubjectively not be able to agree on which one it
It
is,
still has to be a
it
greatest
still has to be. Doesn't it? And so, of course, what Anselm is pointing out for us is that by definition, and of course different languages have, so Bog, Podolsky, Gott, very similar. Pretty darn sure that our English concept of God comes from the German Gott. Seems very close. Deus, Theos, Jesus. I think of lots of different Deo, whatever, where. It's kind of interesting. Israel, right? Temple of the Most High God, El, right? Allah, Ba'el, right? So you're a Middle Eastern El, that sound, Elohim, right? If you think of it, El is basically that Middle Eastern concept, right? So whatever you call it, there's a concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought, and that's what we define as God. And that definition has won, by the way. I mean, there are a lot of folks that may never have heard of that, But even contemporary theologians, like from Yale, that come in, and what's their definition of God? Oh, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. You don't even have to think about it, because you're not saying God is the prime mover. It's pushing the stars around. No. God is outside of time and space. That goes way back to Plato's Timaeus. That's one of the dialogues of Plato that involves the Egyptians. So the Egyptian high priest, basically in communication with Timaeus, explains to the Greeks that yes, God, they've got thousands of years of experience. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, basically. God must exist. And God is God of gods, light of light, true God of true God. An awful lot of the choruses associated with the Christian definition of God are actually ancient. Go back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and so on. Right? So there's kind of like a theological, just like geometry. We can take our geometry back. We can take the alphabet back. Where does the alphabet begin? Well, we can take our theology back, and you could say, okay, so the concept of the gods goes through these evolutionary stages. It's initially powers in the universe that we don't understand. And so we have a multiplicity of gods, one for each of these kinds of powers. Hindus have thousands of gods, right? The Romans had an altar dedicated to the unknown God, just in case we left one out. Right? So if you think of it, that they were powers that are out there that we have to deal with that we don't understand. We try to. So it's kind of like science.
And almost by extension, the Christianity does the same thing with our saints. We got saints dedicated to different things.
That's a whole other interesting aspect of that.
Yeah, and I mean the saints still report to God, but this is the person you talk to about this specific thing to get God's attention.
Oh,
Yeah.
so it's Catholic.
Yes.
Well, and as the Catholic Church incorporated communities that were pagans, a lot of those saints, who's this temple dedicated to? Oh, da-da-da-da-da-da. Oh, really? We have that guy. He's Saint Joseph. Really? We can be part of you and still believe in our saint? Yes. That's a great way of incorporating communities, right, that already have like a sacred, explanation for why that fountain is so beautiful and clear, or whatever, right? Saint Blaise, keep people from choking to death and stuff. But it's actually kind of a mathematical concept. So if you go back to the Egyptians and math, or India and math, wherever math starts, when they get to the point where they realize for the first time that 1 + 1 = 2, you can't have opinions about that. If you think it's 3, we'll kill you because you're wrong, right? And even mom teaches you that, when you come home and you want to tease mom, 2 + 2 = 5. No. Mom is mean that way. You can't mess with math, right? So math, by the way, in Greek is knowledge. Right? So the interesting thing is everything else you can have an opinion about, but math, no. And God, in a sense, is the highest. An easy comparison, I think, is the infinite number, right? Did we do this? What's the mathematical meaning of that? I mean, right? Infinity, right? What happens if I have infinity plus 1? What does that equal? It's very annoying, but mathematicians are just like, wow. What if I have infinity squared? No, it's still this. That's just mean and rotten. How come I can't add more to infinity? It keeps coming back to infinity. Well, whatever you want to label God, God's not numbers, but God is the abstract concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought. The end result of that is, if that's the case, and you say, but pizza exists, but God doesn't, well, you're just wrong. Because if anything exists, it has to be the case that God exists. Which, as Anselm points out, means that God is that necessary being. And the only one. The only thing that cannot be conceived not to exist. I mean, I wasn't. Now I am. Eventually I won't. But you can't conceive of God that way. Because by definition, God precedes and antecedes everything, right? So God must exist. Period.
And I think it was Conway in here, and it seemed really clear, and it fits in kind of with your math demonstration. You know, nothing can come from nothing, but something must be there if there's something. And I mean, that almost is mathematically, but also proven by science, because how far back can we go? The Big Bang. What caused it? Nobody has any idea.
It's just, in a way, another way of framing the question of, you know, what was the beginning? I mean,
Yeah, and nobody can agree on any of them. Sorry.
yeah, kind of the pulse theory, you know, but that's also infinity, you know. In other words, it's always been back and forth, right?
Two liquids collided, creating. I can't think of the
Well, so this is incredibly blatantly obvious, actually, if you see what they're talking about. So therefore, by definition, God is the necessary being. God must exist. Doesn't make sense, as Nietzsche tries to do, to say God is dead. We have killed him. He's not talking about what the theologians are talking about. But what the theologians are talking about is excruciatingly useless, because it doesn't give us any other characteristics. So just because this proof seems to work, and by definition God must exist, doesn't tell you anything else about God. In fact, anything else about God that you come up with basically doesn't fit it. Because if you put any kind of a limitation, a verb, on God, God is good. Well, what about all the evil? God is evil, but what about all the good? God is both good and evil. Can't do that. Conflicts. God is male. That's pretty dang dumb. Obviously, if there is such a thing as a male God, his wife is smarter than he is, right? More powerful, etc., right? Because God is out there, "Arr!" and the wife says, "Come home." Okay. God goes home, Or no dinner for God, that's how that works, right?
7th day, you take it off.
That's hilarious, if you think about it that way. I mean, and if you say, well, God is male, but there is no female, well, that is pretty darn silly. Pardon? Yeah. Plus he has a son.
Yeah. Family guy.
I mean, the Greek stories are absolutely hilarious. I mean, God is eating his children, so mom gives one of the sons a sickle, and he lies in wait for God to step over him, and he cuts his testicles off. That's pretty mean and rotten too, I mean, sorry, you've not heard that story. Then they threw the testicles into the ocean, and that's Venus, right? Aphrodite, so Greeks had really weird stories. So God exists. Not an issue. Where the issue then comes, though, is what have we learned from this? This is just a conceptual puzzle. Okay, so the correct answer to this conceptual puzzle is God exists. By the way, I've gotten lots of papers on this, and the most frequent mistake that people make is they say, God exits, which is just wrong.
It could be true though. If all you
Stage
can prove
right,
that he
right.
exists and then he
God
left.
exits. I could see that in a play, you know, God, Neptune, you know,
Get him out!
God exits, you know, okay. So that's just silly. But yeah, so God exists by definition. You're just silly if you don't get it. But then what follows from that? And that's where we can get into all sorts of arguments that are subjective. Because I want to think, well, if God is that great, God must be a nice guy. Gives everybody A's. Well, because that's what I think is important, right? So I would think God would be like me, right? Wants to give everybody A's, right? Wants progress, right? Loves life. Whoa. You know, I mean, if you're anthropocentric, you know, that, you know, the reason the universe is here is because God wanted to create man. And here we are. And so obviously that's why God created the universe, because we're here. It's called viciously circular reasoning, which I know I left that article off the reading list, but if you read it, that was fun to argue. Specifically, the Descartes' argument is viciously circular, not just merely circular. Every argument that's satisfying is actually circular, because deductive reasoning, it requires, for it to be valid, that your conclusion contain information that's included in your premises. So you're essentially just reiterating what you already know. So deductive reasoning, to be valid, you have to basically know the conclusion ahead of time, which makes it circular. Inductive reasoning, where we don't know the conclusion, so those swans are right, those swans are white, those swans are white, I guess all swans are white. Well, guess what? That's wrong, because there are black swans. But that's inductive reasoning, where you learn something new. But it's also invalid, always, by definition, because it's not circular reasoning. Very frustrating. So all of the new information we have could be wrong. All the stuff we absolutely know is certain is actually fallacious because it's based on circular reasoning. So we have no reasoning skills that are essentially acceptable to logical analysis. Talk about frustrating. Is that boring? It's just kind of true. Phil looks lost.
It's just
Thought
my
of it.
initial reaction is, so what your teacher is telling us is that everything we're learning proves nothing. You know, it's like maybe.
Well,
it's
and
very-
yeah, even if you're convinced that everything proves nothing, it proves nothing. Well, but how do you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So don't feel comfortable in thinking that there is no proof. Actually, the answer to that is that there are proofs within context where you define your terms, and the terms are accepted by the fluent speakers of that particular language or set. And so it's absolutely true that a point is that which has no parts. Although if you doubt it, you just can't do geometry. You're not allowed. If you're playing football and you've got the lines and everything, and you've run 9 yards, and you say it should be first down, and the ref says no, it was short a yard. You say, well, it's pretty close. You should give it to us. No, that's not the rule. Who says that rule is the rule? I think we should change that rule this time so that I have a first down. That guy's confused, right? You have to accept. You can't prove that rule is the legitimate rule. You can say historically this is the rule that was set up. But you know what? If somebody really wants to question that, we have no grounds for proving their doubt except to say, there is no football game rules in heaven, that we've been trying to figure out and refine all along and get close, like, say, chemistry, right? Chemistry, we think, as we're figuring out the contents and atomic number, weight, or of things, we're actually finding something out there that's real. But football, we made that up. We made up the rules. And in fact, we can change the rules if you're in a different kind of stadium that's not big enough for the other kind of field, and we'll change the rules and you only have almost yards to go, I guess. I don't know. How do
We
they
change
do
it
this?
every year just to see what would happen, just for entertainment. They moved the kicking distance back 2 seasons ago. And it
Can
made a
also
huge difference.
can even change the air pressure in the football.
Yeah.
Although if you get caught, you might be in trouble. Sorry. Okay. So, more seriously, Descartes' article. What's wrong with Descartes' ontological argument that makes Anselm's argument from 1100 much better than Descartes'? Descartes, remember, is trying to put all of knowledge on a firm basis, argues that I think, therefore I am. That seems pretty good so far. We can't deny that, although we might expand it, as I said, to the sociological cogito and say, I think, therefore we are, because I don't have a private language. But Descartes isn't wrong for saying, okay, I think, therefore I am, even though you might say, well, but how long does that last? At least at the moment that I'm thinking, I must exist, right? I can't be fooled into that, right? But then, desperate for something else from that point, Descartes gives us this absolutely crazy argument that says, and I can conceive of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. And I couldn't have thunk that up. Thunk, I know it's not a real English word, but I like it. Hot gethunk, I thought. So, God exists in my mind. I couldn't have thought that up. It must have come from a source greater than me. Because, famously, he says, the cause must be greater than the effect. Zoom, that has to be the weakest link in his argument. The cause has to be greater than the effect. The cause of my thinking that there is a God could only be from God himself. Sorry for the masculine pronoun there. So therefore God exists. So that's his version of the ontological argument. Is it viciously circular? I think so. I think it fails. Nobody really tries to defend Descartes' arguments in that case, except the I think, therefore I am part as kind of the bedrock of modern thought, but we don't accept his ontological argument. But we do go back to Anselm. So if we want to argue the definition, by the way, ontos is the Greek word for thing. So ontos is thing. So ontological means the argument from the definition of God, right? It's the ontological argument. And we could look up. So here's the actual text in a medieval internet source. By the way, this is a terrific. So this is from the Proslogium. A longer version of it is the Monologium, which should actually work. Hello. The internet there. Okay, so there it is. So you have a longer version of that. But we could also just look up Anselm. He is interesting. He's Anselm of Canterbury, but he was actually from Italy. The Pope sent him to be the Bishop of Canterbury, which was the main bishopric in England at the time, and the biggest problem for the bishop was dealing with the king, because the king was far away from Rome. So basically, the Bishop of Canterbury was the guy who was supposed to keep the king in check, so that he would basically be like civilized, as opposed to what most of the kings wanted to do, is have fun, do whatever they wanted. And so the king would always get into a fight with the bishop. In fact, the most famous of them was
Thomas Becket.
yeah.
I vote at the door, but it's time for Vespers. Doesn't vote at the doors during Vespers, I've never heard of it.
So this isn't Anselm, this is Thomas Becket.
Everything must be as it should be for divine service.
Short video clip that is more entertaining than the conversation.
Deus in adjutorium meum intende.
Adjudicate, right? So God is my judge.
Is here now. The supreme folly. This is its hour.
Can you see it? No, the light in here is really bad. This is famous. So.
One does not carry arms into God's house. What do you want? Your death. We will continue with the service. Jackson! Tom! Traitor! O Lord, how heavy thy honor is to bear.
Henry's the king, so now he's in trouble for murdering his bishop. Peter O'Toole pretends to be whipped.
Is that supposed to be King Henry?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, yes, it was all agreed. I forgive you. Pigs. Saxon pigs. They certainly wanted their money's worth. Is there a large crowd outside?
Yes, sir.
There's nothing more certain to win them over than the sight of a king doing penance and humbling himself under the lash.
So it was tough being the Bishop of Canterbury. Still is, actually. From what I understand, the Archbishop of Canterbury had to go to the Queen and point out to her, you know, most of your religious members of your kingdom are Islamic. Maybe we really should change some of our British laws to be Sharia law. So that's kind of interesting. However, so in fact, Anselm had to flee a couple times, but went back because it was dangerous being bishop and telling the king you're not allowed to do that. So that's kind of interesting. When I talk about Anselm, I usually like to also talk about the Middle Ages in general. One of the ones I like to bring up, even though we don't have an article this today by Hildegard, Hildegard is really interesting. And there are movies. Is this just music? It is. I was looking for an actual. There is a German movie. I don't see it. Oh, here we go.
October 7th marks the day Saint Hildegard of Bingen will be declared a doctor of the Catholic Church. The German nun was a music composer, writer, and theologian who made a mark by talking about her religious visions.
Estas visiones no eran.
Her visions were not material visions, so to speak. They were experiences she felt in her inner soul. Back in the 12th century, her visions were not always taken seriously. Eventually, she decided to make them public only after getting approval from Pope Eugene III. They dealt with redemption, God, humanity, the church, and also with creation. In fact, one of the drawings that reflect this shows the relationship between the universe and humans. It's an image that's quite similar to that of Leonardo da Vinci.
Ella sitúa en
She includes in her image what she sees, and that's a man at the center of the universe and of nature. It's an image that's very similar to that of Leonardo da Vinci, but she made it centuries before he did. A doctor of the Catholic Church is someone whose theological teachings will remain relevant despite the time period.
So another famous one is Saint Francis. There's some great movies of Saint Francis's life. And that's Sister Clare, Saint Clare.
No.
think this was the most hippiest movie that Franco Zeffirelli, Nino Rota wrote the music. They also had, they did Romeo and Juliet together, which was, I think, still one of the greatest versions of that. But
It's literally frolicking. I mean, he's just frolicking.
that's frolicking. Yeah, if you've never seen Frolic, that's He's the one where you get the statues with him with the birds and the rabbits, but he also has the signs, right? Because just the intensity of his prayers would cause him to get the marks of the cross. There's Sister Claire, too. She was so sexy. Oh my goodness. I don't know if that's changed. I've been watching the Vietnam show, the PBS thing on Vietnam, and you see all the girls, and the guys. I look at them now and I think, wow, we look like idiots. But the girls still strike me as incredibly sexy because of But I guess that's an enculturated thing, the way you feel. But there is no sex in the movie. They're absolutely exactly the way the church depicts them as saints.
Do you remember? I'm Claire. People say you're mad. Do you know that? When you went off to war, they said you were fine, intelligent. But now you're mad because you sing like the birds, and you chase after butterflies, and you look at flowers.
He was ill after the war.
Not now.
When he recovered, he was
Am I disturbing
mentally
you?
different. Sorry. So the Middle Ages. Little spiel on Middle Ages. Life wasn't that bad then at different times. I mean, it's kind of interesting too. There's another pair of star-crossed lovers that are famous, and that's Abelard and Heloise. Familiar with those? I mean, what star-crossed lovers come to your mind when you hear that phrase? Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Isolde. Who else? Should be like 5 or 6 automatic pairs. Yeah. Troilus and Cressida, Aeneas and Leto, isn't it? But a whole bunch of, but Abelard and Heloise, we should be familiar with them. And there's a movie, so you don't have to read their books, but you can instead watch Stealing Heaven.
The was much to lead one astray. Is it nobler to resist temptation, or to avoid it?
It was an age of obedience, when the scriptures ruled. It was a time when a philosopher of the church lived for God.
You've never been with a woman in your life. If I were to take a woman, I would be spitting in the face of God.
Who is he?
That is the great teacher. You're a man like other men.
You have but two choices: to be the bride of man or the bride of Christ.
What soul I ache for him. Every inch of my body longs for his touch.
When a forbidden love, begun in innocence, becomes an obsession.
You'll destroy each other, you know that, don't you?
Almighty God, my friend, sees all, knows all. You find it difficult to repent of this sin?
Yes.
Why? I love you, Father.
In the eyes of God, we are innocent.
But in the eyes of others, they were anything but innocent.
A philosopher can hardly love and keep his vows at the same time.
Through each other, and he's throwing me!
God is love.
There is no God!
You are my Lord. I will love no other.
This isn't the only blood that will flow.
Everything they had believed in, everything they held sacred, everything would be shattered.
It is the time of judgment.
Unforgivable sin, unforgettable love,
Real one. Always.
stealing heaven.
You gotta love those 80s trailers, right? Wow.
Another great medieval period movie, I suppose, is The Name of the Rose.
Within these walls, men come to see.
This is Umberto Eco,
He has come.
the author
to
of the
seek
book.
a killer. We found the body horribly mutilated under a window which was found closed. Somebody took it. A man of reason in a world of blind.
Sean Connery.
Yes, small blood here.
You mean that he committed suicide?
Elementary. And a crime that could not be suppressed. Ink stains. He did not write with his tongue, I presume.
Don't like this place.
I find it most stimulating. Should we kill him? No. I am most curious to see the library for myself. May I do so? No. But what if he should learn it of his own accord? Written with lemon juice. Hey! Who's there?
You overestimate his talents.
This one, I grant you, did not commit suicide. When he is challenged by a man of cruelty and power, the hunter becomes the hunted. Brethren, if you please!
He eventually became Pope. The real. This is based on actual history.
Chosen to look in the wrong direction. Several men of God might still be with us.
Our monks will meet their deaths here, and they also will have blackened fingers and blackened tongues. His found his back, just as Brother William foretold.
Yes, that was right.
He knew, just as I too would have known had I been the murderer.
You will not agree.
Lock him up!
One final murder has been planned.
Master! Master! How do we get out?
With some difficulty. And it's his. Sean Connery as Murray Abraham. The Name of the Rose.
What's the name of the young guy, too? He's famous as an actor now, too, right? William something? Oh, well. So, lots of interesting stuff from the Middle Ages, apart from logical puzzles. Aquinas will give us the cosmological argument. That's, as I suggested earlier, you look at the cosmos and you see cause and effect, and you have to take everything back in time to the first necessary cause, and that by definition has to be the God of the ontological argument. And then the third class of arguments for the existence of God is the teleological. Teleo, or teleos, the same root from Aristotelios, right? So purpose, design. So this is the argument from design. It had to be a great architect or designer that designed all this stuff, and that must be God. So therefore, God exists. The teleological argument. These were really destroyed completely by David Hume. So no one takes those seriously anymore, although I suppose you could still see it in some books. But the ontological argument's still fascinating for a lot of folks because of the definitional characteristic of it. That's an N, right? Ontological. What else? Kierkegaard. Thinking about Kierkegaard, says God cannot be proven to exist, at least in a satisfactory sort of way. You can't prove. I mean, how many folks feel that this ontological argument has been successful in proving that God exists? Kind of interesting. I mean, I accept it, of course, but at the same time, it doesn't have any meat on the bones, so to speak. It doesn't tell you specific characteristics. Like, you can't go from, reading this and say, so Jesus is God. No, it doesn't give you anything that supports that. Doesn't support any particular religious perspective, right? It's essentially like in agreement with the physicists who say there must have been a Big Bang. And
how does that help me?
Yeah, how does that help me? Well, so Søren Kierkegaard, in looking at that dilemma, argues that God cannot be proven to exist. Well, in the sense that it would be kind of a satisfactory sense that God loves you, or that the universe loves you. So if I say, okay, so I think God exists, then I take leaps. Then I start to take leaps that say, and what's the significance for me of saying that as opposed to saying God doesn't exist? Why is the one decision on that better than the other one, right?
Pascal's wager, right?
Pascal's wager. I feel we have to. I feel like if you say that God doesn't exist, there's just this depressing sense, like Schopenhauer gives us, that life sucks. There's no way out of it. It's mean and rotten. You do the best you can so you can have a happy life, but when you get right down to it, life is absolutely miserable.
Well, if you read Solomon, even if God does exist, life's still meaningless. In the fact that anything you do doesn't really have meaning besides the fact
you could certainly accept that God does exist and life is still meaningless. Yes, you can still get that. So the leap for me is to say that the whole point of saying that God exists is to say that we should be affirmative in our thinking that God is love, that the universe is designed to give us the best possibilities of life possible. In other words, look for the positive in it. For me, the difference between now Richard Dawkins can argue that God doesn't exist and that believing in science is absolutely gives him ecstasy, and finding new things, as the beauties of nature, etc. That's where he finds his positive energy, if you want to call it that. Well, I can see that too, but for me that means that there is a God, because I'm still thinking in terms of the highest value. If Richard Dawkins finds nature absolutely beautiful in all of its complexity, then for him the highest value is the beauty in nature and this highest complexity. So for me, his vocabulary is wrong, right? So I think of him as a very religious person, right? Because he's so dedicated to science and teaching and promoting a still very moral point of view. He doesn't go out there and advocate killing people for their beliefs and so on, right? In fact, that's what turns him off about religion, is that so many people who claim to be religious feel like they ought to kill heretics or kill, those Islamists don't believe exactly what we do, so we're going to kill them or, make them slaves or something, right?
Burn the witches.
Burn the witches, yeah. But so Kierkegaard tells us we have to take a leap. You've all heard that leap of faith argument, yes? So especially that leap that you have to take on the night of fear and trembling. And the fear and trembling comes from the person who's getting an education, learns that their childhood interpretation of God is all wrong, but recognizes that you have to have a sense of value and it has to come from some place. So where does that come from? So if you're going through that psychological turmoil where you need something, right? Otherwise you're literally in that depressive funk that happens when you've kind of screwed up your operating system. If you think of your brain as a computer, and from childhood on, parents, peers, schools are all loading an operating system, right? And you get to a point in your life where all of a sudden, somehow something's been loaded in the brain that gives you what Nietzsche's, our God is dead. We don't need him any longer. That's a crisis, a mental crisis in the individual that suddenly realizes it. And Schopenhauer just accepts the pessimism associated with that. Nietzsche feels like, so I'm going out and create value for myself. And that's what will give me a sense of purpose. Kierkegaard takes the leap to Jesus. Instead, he takes a leap of faith to the Lutheran. He's big fights with him and the Lutheran Church in his lifetime, but his main impact is to say that the God of love is the one that you can leap to. But I don't think it actually works for Kierkegaard. He dies of depression when he's, 42? Really young. There were other factors too. He was in pain from young childhood. He had fallen out of a tree and broken his leg or something, and all the rest of his life he had a limp and pain from it not healing very well. His whole family thought that they were cursed, and in fact, either because of the curse or what, they all died young, which is what the father predicted they would all do. They all died young. So their family was cursed. Everybody tries to figure out why were they cursed. By the way, Kierkegaard is a depressing name. It's because Kirk is church and yard is the churchyard. So basically their name is cemetery. Because the house that they lived in was given to them by the church and it was on the cemetery. So I have these, Stephen King horror stories, imagining that, finding all these corpses in your basement. Very depressed. Plus they're Danish. And I don't know how you could grow up Danish and be happy. And yet, at one point they said that the Danes were the happiest people on earth. Have you heard that? Yes?
I've never heard that. I don't know enough about the Danish to argue one side or the other.
P-E-O-P-L-E. I don't know. You believe it? What? I was happy, now I'm not. Thanks. How can that go away? I'll go somewhere else. That's just... But if have you ever been to Denmark? And look, it looks like New Jersey without they have some mountains in New Jersey, but if you're looking at Denmark, it's like just nothing. Right out to the Baltic Ocean, or whatever, Baltic Sea, whatever we call it. So it's kind of so what's a good quiz question for today? I have to be careful because I've been using my test questions as quiz questions, I notice. So if you think about, remember the, by midnight tonight, theoretically, your first test should be in. Everybody caught on to that, I hope?
Yeah, you'll be getting a few emails from me today.
Okay, good. I've already got some that I haven't returned that I saw last night. Remember, I'm out drinking Wednesday night, so I don't do any grading. I could, but it might be really weird. I had 2 whole glasses of wine last night.
Whoa.
Stepping out there.
And then I drove home.
I had 2, and then I came here for my night class. They were beer.
But, so anyway, so the exams are due. But so what, and I did, all 3 of them are now posted.
All 3 tests.
Yeah.
Can we turn in the other 2 tests early, or do you want them within the day?
Yep, you can send them in. Hopefully the class will actually change your mind about some things, but that's okay. Either way. Just so long as you spend some time getting the requisite amount.
Oh, wait, another great like medieval movie I should watch is
That's a good one.
That's a really
That's the one where the crusade against
it's not 3 hours long, but
yeah.
definitely
made the good guys seem like the bad guys.
Does it have Richard the Lionhearted in it?
Briefly at the very end, it's like a footnote in history.
Liam Neeson's in there.
It would be the second crusade.
So how about this as a quiz question, because I know you want to leave. Would you have wanted to live in the Middle Ages? That's a dumb question. That's no good. How about this? What positive things do we have from the Middle Ages? The positive things. There's answers to that. Because if you look at Aristotle's information comes back into the West after the Crusades, and that is terribly disruptive, leads to the scholastic period. But as a result of that, you end up with the scientific revolution. How did that come about? Well, it wasn't just Aristotle. It was all those years in the so-called Dark Ages. They actually developed quite a lot of logic theory that then they applied to Aristotle when it came in. So the the scientific revolution was a revolution against Aristotelian thinking that I think resulted because of all the advances they had made logically in medieval Europe. And so and a lot of the great theologians, what was so significant about them was their logical development. In the movie The Name of the Rose, Brother William was theoretically William of Ockham, another great logician. So you end up with advances that took place there that when the Greek Renaissance really comes in, you end up with a revolt against it that begins the modern world. So there are advances made in medieval Europe that lead to modern times. So. Oh well. Have a good weekend. Be safe. I don't know what's going on anywhere, but I'm sure stuff is.
Everybody's just being sick.
Stop it. Stop being sick.
Work it out.
Be healthy.
Yeah, it's been all this.
I should have asked, did you have any questions based on the reading, or my interpretations of the reading? Or these seem like the funnest arguments, but Hume destroyed them. He said, how do you know?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Good time.
Thank you for your participation. Yes.
So,
Thanks. You
like
had a lot of
Tuesday.
participation last class.
Yeah, no, Tuesday when Megan and we were talking, I'm still a little confused like what we were talking about because when you had brought up stocks, I started asking her a question because stocks go up and down, people buy and sell, and so
psychology,
so I was really confused about how you were talking about how like you always want to improve yourself and like show like the best and better, but then people sometimes will still be turned away. And so I'm still kind of like stuck on that and still kind of confused because not everyone's going to accept it every time. So the meaning behind like everything being perfect and everyone liking you after that was just kind of lost on me because it's never going to be like that every single time.
That's true. That's true. I'm not sure.
And like I'm just still kind of lost on it.
The reason I asked what was going on is because while you guys were talking, I wasn't noticing it, but the guy sitting right here in front of me turned and looked back at you like you were bothering his ability to listen to what you were so that's why I interrupted.
Well, no, and that was totally fine, because like we weren't trying to be loud or anything, and I completely understood that. But like I also didn't answer the quiz question because I was still like was thinking about it, and I was like I just don't fully understand, I guess, the point he was trying to make with that. Because in my head, it's not going to always work, if that makes any sense.
Let me try to think what we were talking about. How did that come into the argument?
What was the quiz question?
Today?
No.
I don't know how to pronounce it. Some German word, I'm assuming. It's essentially...
Übermensch?
Yes, thank you, that one.
Oh, yeah.
Well, see, I just went online to double check what the actual definition of Übermensch was, and then when I looked at that, it made it pretty easier. It's just more or less you being in control of your own fate and not allowing someone else to basically tell you how to live your life, more or less. So based off that, that's how I basically wrote my quiz answer, was basically stating that I am the one who decides what I believe and what morality is.
Americans are by definition Übermenschen. We don't say that, but every one of us is supposed to be our own critical thinker, our own right. I mean, it's absolutely true that a lot of us grow up in institutional settings, or and you believe what everyone tells you, and yet and it's actually funny that to some extent everyone tells us you're supposed to be your own thinker. Don't do what everybody tells you to do.
But like,
this way.
Truthfully, you've never had an original thought. So,
from a
I put that in my quiz answer is we're told to do that. However, when we do it, they say no, shut up.
Yeah.
It's a real dilemma. The dilemma of freedom. There's all kinds of interesting issues over that. But what Nietzsche's talking about is that you doubt what the church tells you. So you are your own moralist. You're the one that has to decide what morals are right for you.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have laws, so you can't decide to just shoot criminals because you don't like them or something.
And that was another thing today I was thinking about and I didn't want to get into the religious debate because I have my own beliefs, and I know one kid from another class that's also in this class who has his own beliefs, so I didn't want to get into that. But when Nietzsche's talking about, oh, God is dead, in my head that's just like you have to make your own morals, because some people are like, oh, well, God set these morals out, so that's what we need to believe. And by taking God away, it's saying, well, you don't have to listen to those, but you have to listen to yourself. And I feel like that was more of his point, because like I wrote the paper on it last semester, and like just from reading it, that's just what I gathered as his point, was more, you have to base everything on your beliefs rather than what this person is telling you to do. But
and it's not going to be for everyone. Yeah, that's a very elitist point of view. that those that get this kind of education evolve their thinking to the point where they're no longer being controlled by the authorities, but you're now your own boss. You're an Ubermensch, right? But there's desperate aspects of that too, that, you know, because it's comforting believing that the priests are telling you all the truth, and that that's very comforting. You know, I know one minister who, as he evolved his thinking, would incorporate those updates to his sermons. And he had, it was a Methodist church, and the one elder in the church came up to him and says, "Why do you have to keep bringing up, just stick to the old stuff." You know, he didn't want to hear the new stuff. He didn't want to have to think about these puzzles and wonder about morality and the grounds for morality. You know, he just wanted the old, you know, just can't you keep that old time religion? You know, that's good enough for me. I don't want to get into arguments over faith and everything. Yeah, you give that up when you decide that you can't accept that because you know, what? But they're wrong. I could see the historical basis for that, and look what bad things have come from that. Here's some good things, but you know what? The church itself is a historical, evolving group of people, and people make mistakes. And
bad things in medieval. Catholic Church was actually like the most corrupted, vile thing probably in the medieval ages there was.
What, the church?
Yeah, Catholic Church, to be precise. Really,
well, you can look. You can certainly. I mean, there's so much there. It's like saying, "Oh, the United States is the great Satan," as Iran Ayatollahs say. You know, well, you know, there's absolutely fantastic things in the United States too. There are some things that are evil as they describe it, but there's all sorts of other things that we think of as great, and that their country's evil. You know, so you always end up making blatant errors when you use collective nouns, and whenever you say always, like I just did, you know, you're always gonna make a mistake when you do that. Never use always. And never use never. Is this fun?
I enjoy the class. A lot of it for me is like, sometimes I feel like it overlaps with last class. And so for me, I'm just kind of like, okay, yeah, we kind of went over that, and then you'll make a new point, and I'm like, okay, like, where are we at now? Because, like, I like being able to compare, like, the intro versus the modern, and seeing the differences and seeing what has changed, but that the majority of it is, like, just the difference in wording and how that pushes it further. And that, to me, is really interesting. It's like one word can change, and it's a completely different thing.
That's when you get to phonology, morphology, and a bunch of other different things. I'm taking the linguistics class of this, and linguistics plus anthropology. They pretty all blend pretty well with each other. Like, at the same time, even when you look at things, have we really evolved much? I mean, you might say that we're in a democratic republic, but more it's like an oligarchy right now. You got the top
or a
1%.
plutocracy.
Yeah, well, we basically got the
where the wealthy rule.
Yeah, exactly. I make the joke it's more like an oligarchy because you got these CEOs that are basically acting as though kings making the laws now, basically passing the laws versus the democratic republic that we first started with.
But see, I don't like to say like we've evolved as a whole, because like we can look in the Middle East and they're just now letting women drive cars, and it's actually going to have to change a lot of their laws, because that means that the women don't need men to go out with them anymore. It was a law that women could not be out in public without a male chaperone, and so now those laws are going to have to change. So I much prefer looking at it from the individual, if I can speak, a single person, because I obviously can't speak today, rather than like just society and the world as a whole. Because if one person changes their thinking, that leads slowly to other people changing their thinking.
And the funny thing is, the U.S. wasn't that much different in the early 1900s. Like, as far as women going out, mostly what the guy had asked a woman to go out and date. Women couldn't really do a lot of things by themselves. So really, when you look at the Middle East, you're kind of looking at an earlier developmental aspect of the United States.
And when you think about it, that's barely over 100 years ago. And so for us to say, oh, that's like so barbaric.
Yeah, we act like it's archaic, but really
it wasn't that long ago when you look at the big picture. And that's what a lot of people also don't understand is like that wasn't that long ago.
The sad thing is U.S. has kind of slowed on their steamroll of, and U.S. was like the leading in the world of rights and people and respect and power.